Right, so I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about gender history this afternoon. I'm looking specifically at China in the early 20th century and this idea of the new woman. So the specific points of my talk are going to be literary and visual representations of the new woman. So we're going to look at short stories in particular and how male and female authors approach this idea differently in literature. Then I'm going to talk quite briefly about film and how it can continue this discourse, but by introducing a new visual element, it changes the game and bridges this divide between fantasy and reality in quite an interesting way. And then I'm going to finish off my sort of history part of the talk by talking about two women's actual experiences and how this might play out in individual women's lives. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about why some of this might be significant and what wider points we can take from this. So before I get on to the main meat of my talk, what do I actually mean when I say the new woman? So we haven't really got time to go into early 20th century Chinese history in detail, but the early 20th century sees extreme political, social, economic change in a vast array of areas, but perhaps the most pronounced area is in the changes it brought in for urban women. So really in urban areas in China, and particularly the coastal cities, we see new categories of women. So we see film actresses, dance hostesses, secretaries, factory workers, all emerging as sort of new social forms or new social opportunities for women. And we also see a change in the nature and extent of prostitution. And what's important about all of these changes is that they mark a massive increase in visibility for women in what we might call the public space. The Chinese have a different word for it, wai, which means outer. It doesn't exactly match our idea of the public sphere, but it's close enough for this talk. So, and I want to be clear that women before the 20th century have a very complicated history in China, and it's not true to say that they were entirely domestically confined. This marks an entry into a formerly very male space, the public sphere, on a scale that's really unprecedented. And alongside this, we see changes to discourses and discussions of women in both literary and visual media. So alongside an increased entry of women into public spaces, we see representations of them in public spaces in a way that normalises this idea. So that's really a major sea change in the way gender constructions work in China. And the other very interesting thing about discourses on women during this period is they explicitly link this idea of the woman in public, or the new woman, to modernity. So when I say the new woman, we're really talking about both of these issues, new representations of women and new social realities for women. And the problem that we sometimes have in history is that historians tend to talk about one or the other and not link them together. But I think hopefully, as we'll see, if we link them together, we can see some fairly interesting things. So let's start with fantasy and the discourse. And to start with literature, I've got two quotes here from one of the most famous male writers in China's 20th century, a man called Lu Xun. This first quote, which is from one of his most famous stories, actually, New Year's Sacrifice, I don't want to dwell on for too long, but suffice it to say it's describing a woman in what Lu Xun in his story explicitly categorizes as a traditional or backward area of China. And it talks about her being suppressed, she is ostracized and reduced to a beggar-like state because she violates a traditional taboo of remarrying as a woman after being widowed. And what Lu Xun sets up in this story is an idea that this oppression of women is indicative of a backwardness in society. So we can see here, like I said before, there is a discursive link in Lu Xun between the idea of modernity and the idea of women's treatment. In this case, it's negative. Her sister Xianglin, which is the name of the woman, her oppression symbolises Chinese society's backwardness in general. And he contrasts this explicitly with the modern cities, which sort of hang on the periphery of the story. In contrast to this, we can see from another of Lu Xun's stories, this is a declaration by one of his characters, Zijun, who declares to her male lover, who narrates the story to us, that she's independent of these socially oppressive forces, and she's a liberated woman. So she could be the new woman, if we like. The problem comes when we look a little bit closer at the second story, because what actually happens is, after this declaration, Zijun and her lover embark on an attempt to fight against these social prejudices and live together and oppose parentally arranged marriage. What happens is the social pressures during the story mount up, their relationship falls apart, and it ultimately results in Zijun's death. And what's really interesting is the attitude which the male narrator, who is also a writer, interestingly, takes towards Zijun immediately before and immediately after her death. Immediately before her death, they're estranged, they've grown apart, they find it difficult to communicate with each other, and he's very much hostile to Zijun. But after her death, he transforms her into this fantasy figure of the new woman, and he uses her as a tool to, if we like, explore his own modernity and continue his fight against society. So I think what Lucian's stories might suggest to us are that for the male writers in this period, what's particularly important about the New Woman is the ideal. By expressing an interest in female emancipation, by criticising the old society's treatment of women, males are declaring their own modernity. They're using it instrumentally. They're saying, we are modern because we support liberation for women, rather than being explicitly interested in women's actual experiences. Now, we can contrast this with the writings of one of the most famous female writers of the 20th century, writing at a very similar time. This woman, Ding Ling, wrote a number of stories across a very long period, but this is probably her most famous work. It's a piece called Miss Sophia's Diary, as you can see. And what Ding Ling here is she really completely inverts what's going on in Lucian. So in Lucian, we normally have a male narrator who looks at women as an object of modernity, and women are a marker, a measure, or a tool for expressing male modernity. They're not the subjects. Whereas here, we have a female subject, Miss Sophia, who ticks most of the boxes for what we would consider being New Woman. She's urban, she's independent, she's not noted, or she's not explicitly part of a family group in the ways that old women were characterised as being. And here we have her as a subject treating a male as an object, in this case a sexual object. And Lucian is Ding Ling is one of a number of writers, female writers during this period, who are doing very similar things. And it's also interesting that this is in diary format. So female writers tended to use diary forms, letters, or pseudo-autobiographies. And they really seem to be experimenting to develop a distinctly female voice in literature. And as we can see, I think what they're doing with this distinctly female voice is they are co-opting the idea of the New Woman. Like I said, Miss Sophia matches the profile quite well. And they're using it, rather than the males who are using it instrumentally, they're using it to explore female subjectivities, in this case, female desire. And for 1927, this is really quite provocative. The idea that women might have an independent desire is quite a new idea in China, and this is certainly one of the most famous examples of an early exploration of it. So that's the basics of the literary discourse. But from the late 1920s onwards, we see a shift in the cities towards film as the dominant popular art form. And this picture is of a film star, Ran Lingyu, who was very famous in the early 1930s, particularly in Shanghai. And we're going to talk about her a bit more in a bit. But what's important to note for the moment is that film, in many ways, carries on this earlier literary discourse with explicitly associating women with the idea of modernity, and particularly from the male perspective, it tends to focus on the male perspective of literature and using it as a measure of modernity rather than exploring female subjectivity. And many of the stories from the same sort of tradition as Lucian which Lucian and Ding Ling were writing, which is called the Mayfall tradition, were made into films. But what's new about film is this visual element. We can now see the New Woman in a way that we couldn't before. And now the New Woman has an appearance, she can be mimicked in reality, or in this case in advertisements. So all of these, although it's difficult to tell with the one on the left and the right, are actually advertising products. And we also see in reality nightclub hostesses, prostitutes, as I pointed out, film actresses, all try to portray themselves as the New Woman. So you can see, particularly the woman in the middle and on the left, are wearing what's called the qipao, which is very similar to what Ran Lingyu is wearing there. It's also a qipao. And this garment in particular becomes associated with the New Woman. And so by buying into this fashion discourse, there's a whole sort of capitalist market relationship here about the idea of selling modernity, which sadly we haven't really got time to go into, but it's very interesting. But by wearing these clothes, by taking on the image of the New Woman, women are associating themselves and their bodies with a fantasy discourse. So we can see reality and fantasy coming together in quite an interesting way. And to give you an idea of how that might have worked in practice, just have a quick look at the actual experiences of two women. So we're going to start again with Ran Lingyu. So like I said, Ran Lingyu is a very famous film actress. And in 1935, she committed suicide after an extensive press campaign of press coverage of her private life, and in particular her separation from her first husband. And what's interesting in the press coverage is the reason they are interested in her private life is because she has this appearance, because she portrays new women in films, she's explicitly linked to the idea of Chinese modernity. She has become symbolic of it. And therefore, it is in the public interest to ensure she behaves in particular ways and continues to hold up that image of modernity, and it imposes great restraints on her freedom of action, and ultimately leads to her suicide. And what's very interesting is that the way she commits suicide, she overdoses on a recreational drug, is that it very closely mirrors the suicide of a character that she portrayed in her final film before she died. And I think we can see here that reality and fantasy have been confused to the extent that perhaps even Ran Lingyu herself is unable to separate her individual self from the discourse and the fantasy which she's portraying. So Ran Lingyu is an example of how this collision of fantasy and reality could be extremely problematic for women in early 20th century China. In contrast, this is Shi Jianchao, who has been described as China's first female assassin, and she really is able to co-opt this fantasy-reality collision in a way that's very, very useful for her and allows her to exercise a particular kind of agency. So in 1935, she executed or assassinated a former warlord. So in the 1910s, China basically degenerates into a series of regional polities with military strongmen running them. And in 1927, it's reunified, but these warlords continue to have a considerable amount of political power and become associated in the Chinese mind with backwardness and obstacles to progress. So she assassinates one of these men in revenge for him murdering her father a few years earlier. And afterwards, she immediately turns herself into the courts. And during her trial for murder, she very carefully manages her public image. So she chooses clothes like the cheap owl that conspicuously associate herself with the idea of the new woman. And she really emphasises this idea of women as indicative of Chinese modernity. So she, as the symbol of Chinese modernity, destroys a warlord, a symbol of Chinese backwardness, and she really emphasises this and buys into an idea of national regeneration. And she really taps into a really powerful vein in public sentiment and gains enormous popularity. And although she's actually found guilty for murder, the nationalist government is basically forced by popular demand to pardon her and let her go free. So Shi Jianchao is an example of how this collision of fantasy and reality could be used by women and co-opted. So that's really a very brief introduction to how fantasy and reality came together in quite complicated ways in the early 20th century in China. What does this actually tell us about gender and social issues more generally? So most obviously, gender bridges the divide between fantasy and reality, and we need to examine how they interact with each other together. So we need to be aware that these discourses or these issues operate in tandem, but also operate together in quite complex ways. More specifically, if we think back to Dingling, women can co-opt discourses that seem problematic or instrumentalist, such as male writers' approach to the new woman, and they can use them for their own advantage. And in particular, female art can be very important for doing this. So things like the visibility of female art might be things we need to think about. And finally, discourse and reality come together in ways that are both empowering and inhibiting, and this seems to be dependent on quite specific circumstances. And so I think we need to examine cases very carefully and be wary of making reductive generalisations about whether this is good or bad. Yeah, thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
Just because I don't know very much about it, out of interest, why was it so important for China to maintain that image of modernity at the time? And especially with reference to the figure of the new woman, which, am I right in saying that's originally a sort of fin de siècle, like European idea?
It's complicated as to how the new woman, as an English term, it was definitely a fin de siècle, and we apply it to this period. Okay. And one of the terms which was used in Chinese is a direct translation of that. So right, okay. There's a strong Western influence. It gets quite complicated, the ideas of modernity and imperialism. Yeah. And it's very difficult to separate, particularly in China, where sort of what you might call indigenous discourses and Western imports, one begins and the other ends. Yeah. But yet this idea really kicks off in the 1890s, the idea that China is somehow backward or inferior to the West socially. And what reformers sort of settle on really quite quickly is that the major problem is that women are unproductive. And then from there it transforms from women are unproductive to social oppression of women as a symbol of Chinese backwardness.
Are there any other questions? Could you talk a bit more about the commodification of modernity? And you talked about being able to buy modernity. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, basically in China's cities, and Shanghai in particular, we see in the early 20th century a real sort of explosion of what we might call commercial capitalism, and in particular in places like nightclubs, what really they do in terms of the new woman image is they take it, what had been a literary discourse and sort of a political discussion, and they commodify it. So now you have actual women wearing these clothes, portrayed as the new women, and you can buy into them. You can buy into modernity by buying a dance with a hostess, by sleeping with a prostitute who's portrayed itself as modern, has acquired English as a second language perhaps. And really we get into a very complicated territory where it's difficult to separate basically imperial relationships between the West and China, and sort of this idea of fetishizing the West, capitalism as a commodifying discourse, and sort of gender discourses. And it basically generates into a huge mess, to be honest.
Great. Are there any more questions? One at the back, yeah.
I was just curious, how much do you think that the New Women sort of movement actually was beneficial? Because you said before that women were sort of part of the more public sphere before, I was just wondering, like, do you think it was beneficial, or like obviously there's drawbacks to everything, but how much did it like help women?
Well, obviously there are drawbacks to everything, like you said. The problem is sort of in terms of historiography, we're in the middle of a sort of sea change in that up to the 1980s there was very much this idea that women before the 20th century were just entirely domestically rooted, and they were used, sort of traditional Chinese women are used often in earlier feminist theory actually as sort of an image of what totally oppressed women look like in the patriarchy. The problem is from the 1980s we've done a lot of historical research and realised it's not actually true, but we haven't come up with a sort of complete model of how we might understand the earlier period. I think in some respects the New Woman is empowering for women. It provides a certain type of woman with new opportunities, new senses of mobility, and even things like dance hostesses, which we would probably consider commodifying and sort of objectifying, often offer better sort of commercial and economic opportunities for women than did the alternatives, which were things like factory work. The problem really comes in is who gets to buy into the New Woman image, and if you have a look in the journal I talk a bit more about class issues, but the New Woman really takes on a lot, or is a point of tension between different classes, and particularly to begin with she's very much a sort of upper class construct, and although it's seemingly applied to all women, it's really talking about upper class women. Later on it does actually enable sort of lower class women perhaps to enter new worlds and new social environments that they hadn't had access to before. So I think on one hand it's very empowering, but on the other hand there's a whole different element, like we saw with Ran Ling Yu, where there are a new set of limitations that come along with that.
Yes, we'll just take one more quick one. Yeah.
Was there an extent to which women resisted the commodification of female image and the rise of prostitution, and also maybe class antagonism to a certain extent to which women tried to open up greater horizons other than a form of empowerment that passed only through the market? And did that feed us all into the class struggle and the communist movement that happened in China in this period that took power in 1949? Because I don't know much about the history of the communist movement in China, but obviously elsewhere it was very tied to almost exactly the same terminology, the idea of a new communist or Soviet man, a new Soviet woman, and lots of the communist revolutions in Europe were at least initially extremely emancipatory for women in certain regards, and in other regards eventually not. And also, to what extent perhaps some of the resistance being drawn into that, how it may have reinforced these struggles as well.
In terms of resistance to the sort of commodifying and objectifying discourse, there's some interesting examples in literature of trying to make the female inaccessible to men and trying to create a sort of, we might call it feminine mystique, but that perhaps has the wrong associations. In terms specifically of the communist movement, the CCP is founded in 1921, and Ding Ling later joins it, and Lu Xun, although he never joins it, is quite sympathetic to the communists. The left wing has a lot to do with these ideas of the New Woman, and then again in my essay I talk a bit about how left-wing writers try to co-opt the New Woman in a different way. There is a sense in which the Communist Party offers women a means of resisting both sort of traditional constraints and commercial restraints. There's a lot of work that's been done about by historians on whether the CCP really reproduced what's sometimes called democratic patriarchy. So it gives women slightly greater mobility, but they're still subordinate. And for instance, it is true that women never really get to occupy key leadership positions in the Communist Party. It's particularly interesting actually in terms of the communist attitude to women post-1949, because they do adopt a very sort of emancipatory stance. But this idea of modernity, in some respects, gets taken to an even further extreme after the communists take control, and the idea of remaking women to symbolise modernity becomes very powerful, and it really culminates in the Cultural Revolution when, to some extent, some communists anyway tried to destroy gender constructions entirely, and it didn't really work very well.